My name is Jasmine, 33 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. One Thanksgiving, my family left my dinner on a paper plate on the porch because I was not clean enough to eat inside. I ate alone in my car and drove off. 9 years later, my sister found me, and what she saw made her call everyone. The chat went silent, then the calls started. 69 in 1 hour. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My family measured people by money, and Brittany had always been their golden child. She married Cameron, a polished finance executive, while I became the daughter they preferred not to explain. To them, my worn clothes and relentless work were proof that I had failed. To me, they were the price of building something no one in that house could imagine. After 9 years without a single real conversation, Brittany had finally walked into my life again inside a resort where she believed I was merely arranging flowers. Now I stood in the grand lobby of Aura Estates, the ultra-luxury resort I owned in Napa Valley. The morning sunlight poured through the massive windows, catching the gold veins in the marble reception desk. The air smelled of fresh eucalyptus and cedar wood. I wore a simple navy blue blazer and comfortable black slacks. I was personally adjusting an arrangement of white orchids on the front counter to maintain the standard of excellence my resort was known for. The peaceful silence shattered when the heavy glass doors swung open. The sharp clicking of expensive heels echoed across the marble floor. "Still clearing tables and arranging flowers, Jasmine?" a loud, grating voice demanded. My bare hands froze. The voice belonged to the woman who had spent my childhood making me feel small. I slowly turned around to face my sister Brittany. She wore a bright red designer dress, oversized sunglasses pushed up into her styled blonde hair, and carried a white leather handbag that cost more than most people made in a month. She slammed her heavy handbag onto the pristine counter, completely disregarding the delicate orchids I had just arranged. Her eyes roamed up and down my simple outfit with obvious disgust. "Find me the manager right now," Brittany ordered. "I am booking a VIP event and I do not have time to deal with low-level staff." I stood perfectly still, letting the shock wash over me. 9 years of absolute silence, and here she was treating me like dirt. She had no idea that I was the sole owner of Aura Estates. I made a split-second decision to let her believe exactly that. "Good morning, Brittany," I said, my voice incredibly calm. "How can I assist you today?" Brittany rolled her eyes dramatically. "I just told you, I need a manager. My husband Cameron is bringing his elite investors here for our 10th anniversary vow renewal. We need the best luxury suite you have and the grand ballroom. And since you happen to work here, you can make yourself useful," she continued. "I expect a massive family discount on this booking. Cameron is bringing billionaires to this resort. You should be thanking me for the exposure. If you do not give me the VIP pricing, I will personally speak to the invisible owner of this place and have you fired before lunch." The irony of her threat was almost too sweet to bear. She was threatening to have me fired by me. I looked at her angry, entitled face. She was so desperate to project wealth. I remembered how she had laughed when our mother told me to eat on the porch. I remembered the freezing cold air in my car as I ate my turkey alone. "I understand," I replied softly, keeping my expression blank. "A 10th anniversary is a very special occasion. Let me pull up our booking system and see what we can do for you and Cameron." I stepped behind the reception desk and logged into the main computer terminal. My fingers flew across the keyboard, opening the reservation software. I bypassed the standard employee view and accessed my private executive portal. "The total cost for the grand ballroom and the executive luxury suite for a weekend event is $250,000, I stated clearly, watching her face for a reaction. Brittany did not blink. She waved her hand dismissively. Money is not an issue for people like us, Jasmine. Just put it in the system. But I want 50,000 knocked off the top for the inconvenience of having to look at you. I did not argue. I simply smiled. In order to secure the date and the ballroom, the system requires a non-refundable deposit of $50,000 today. I will need a credit card to hold the reservation. Brittany scoffed loudly and pulled out a sleek black corporate credit card. She tossed it onto the marble counter like a piece of trash. Run it. And make sure you spell Cameron's holding company name right on the receipt. I picked up the heavy metal card. I swiped it through the terminal and waited for the system to process the transaction. As the computer communicated with the banking network, a severe warning flashed across my private executive screen in bright red letters. The message was highly confidential, accessible only to corporate owners tied into the global financial database. It read, "Warning. Holding component flagged for extreme debt. Impending default imminent. High-risk transaction." I stared at the glowing red letters on my monitor. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Cameron was not bringing billionaires to Napa Valley for a romantic vow renewal. He was bringing them here because his company was drowning in toxic debt, and he was desperate to secure a bailout investment. He was using this lavish, outrageously expensive party to create a fake facade of immense wealth. They were completely bankrupt. He had absolutely no actual capital remaining. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place perfectly. Brittany was standing in front of me, dripping in diamonds and demanding luxury, while her entire financial world was secretly collapsing beneath her feet. She was wearing thousands of dollars in stolen equity right on her body. The system prompted me to either decline the card due to the high-risk status or override the warning and accept the charge. If I declined it, Brittany would throw a fit, leave, and find another venue to trick her investors. But if I accepted it, I would hold the contract for their massive, fraudulent event. I looked up from the screen. Brittany was tapping her foot impatiently. A smug, arrogant smile plastered across her face. She truly believed she had won. She believed she had walked into this beautiful resort and permanently put me in my place. I slowly pressed the override button. I accepted the charge. The receipt printer whirred to life, spitting out the paper confirmation. I handed her the receipt, watching her snatch it away with greedy fingers. She turned around and marched back out the glass doors, completely oblivious to the fact that her downfall had just begun. The prey had finally walked straight into my carefully laid trap. The blinking red warning on my executive monitor seemed to pulse in time with my own heartbeat. High-risk transaction. Impending default. I stared at the name of Cameron's holding company glowing on the screen, and the pristine eucalyptus-scented air of my luxury lobby suddenly felt suffocatingly cold. The metallic click of the heavy glass doors closing behind Brittany echoed through the grand foyer, leaving me in absolute silence. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, measured breath, but the flashing red alert had already pulled the pin on a memory I had kept buried under layers of corporate strategy and relentless ambition for almost a decade. 9 years ago. It was Thanksgiving Day, and a bitter, biting frost had settled over my parents' sprawling suburban estate. I was 24 years old and running on fumes. At the time, I was working 2 grueling minimum-wage jobs to fund the early stages of my software startup. I woke up at 4 in the morning to steam milk and scrub espresso machines at a local coffee shop, dealing with impatient commuters who never even looked me in the eye. After a full day of coding on a public computer in the local library because I could not afford my own internet access, I scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans at a commercial office building until midnight. Every single dollar I made went into server space, legal filing fees, and basic operational costs. I was chronically exhausted, perpetually stressed, and surviving on a diet of cheap instant noodles. My clothes reflected my reality. I wore thrifted sweaters with fraying cuffs, faded jeans, and work boots that had been repaired with cheap glue more times than I cared to admit. I had driven to my parents' house that afternoon, hoping for a brief reprieve. I just wanted one warm, home-cooked meal. I wanted to sit in a heated room, hear the comforting hum of family chatter, and maybe just for a few hours pretend I was safe and supported. When I walked through the back door into the kitchen, the air was thick with the rich, buttery smell of roasted turkey and expensive sage candles. I could hear the clinking of fine crystal and the booming, confident laughter of men in expensive suits coming from the formal dining room. The dining room table had been set for 12. I knew this because I saw the seating chart, elegantly written in gold calligraphy on the kitchen counter, resting next to a massive crystal vase of imported winter roses. My name was not on it. Before I could even take off my damp winter coat, my mother Beatrice intercepted me. She wore a tailored silk dress and a string of pearls that caught the soft kitchen lighting. Her eyes swept over my frayed sweater and scuffed boots, her face contorting into a mask of pure panic and intense disgust. She quickly pulled me behind the kitchen island, yanking me out of the line of sight from the dining room archway. "What are you doing here looking like that?" Beatrice hissed, her voice a sharp, venomous whisper. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not offer me a warm hug. She simply grabbed a flimsy thin paper plate from a leftover stack in the pantry. With hurried, jerky movements, she carved a few dry slices of leftover turkey and dropped a single careless scoop of cold mashed potatoes onto the paper. She shoved the plate into my chest, forcing me to take it. "Cameron's wealthy family is here," she whispered harshly, her eyes darting nervously toward the dining room. "His parents flew in on a private charter. Your cheap clothes and your obvious exhaustion are not clean enough for the dining room. You look like a beggar. Eat outside on the back porch so you do not embarrass Brittany." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the back door, leading to the unheated, freezing patio. I stood there holding a bending paper plate that was already soaking through with thin gravy, looking at the woman who had given birth to me. From the other room, I heard Brittany's melodic, practiced laugh, followed by the warm, approving voice of Cameron's father. They were warm. They were celebrating. They were family. And I was a dirty secret to be hidden in the cold. I did not argue. I did not scream or throw the plate or demand a seat at the table. The absolute chilling lack of love in my mother's eyes crystallized something deep inside my chest. It was a profound, life-altering moment of clarity. The fragile hope I had been carrying around that my family would eventually see my worth simply evaporated into the cold air. I took the paper plate, pushed open the back door, and walked out into the freezing November evening. But I did not sit on the porch. I kept walking down the icy driveway to my beat-up, rusting sedan. I sat in the driver's seat, my breath pluming in the freezing air, my hands trembling so violently I could barely grip the plastic steering wheel. I turned the key in the ignition just to get the heater running, listening to the engine struggle and sputter before finally catching. Sitting there in the dim green glow of the dashboard lights, I ate my cold turkey, alone. I chewed every bite methodically, making a silent, unbreakable promise to myself with every swallow. I would never be cold again. I would never be hungry again. And I would never, ever allow another human being to make me feel small. When the paper plate was empty, I backed out of the driveway and drove away. 5 miles later, I pulled into a brightly lit gas station and went through my contacts with hands that had stopped shaking. I blocked my mother, my father, and Brittany. Within a week, I changed my phone number, closed the email account they knew, and moved without leaving a forwarding address. I kept my legal name, Jasmine Wilson, but stopped allowing it to mean I belonged to them. Over the next 9 years, I poured every ounce of that freezing night into disciplined ambition. I secured venture capital, built Vanguard Holdings, acquired distressed companies, and turned failing properties into profitable assets, until the family that had hidden me on a porch could no longer reach the world I had created. The scent of fresh eucalyptus pulled me sharply back to the present moment. The grand sunlit lobby of Aura Estates materialized around me once more. I was not 24 anymore. I was not cold, and I was certainly not wearing frayed cuffs. I was the sole owner of a multi-million-dollar luxury resort, and the woman who had laughed while I was banished to the porch had just handed me the keys to her financial destruction. I looked back down at the glowing monitor. The high-risk warning regarding Cameron's holding company was still blinking, demanding a managerial response. Brittany had demanded a VIP experience. She had demanded that I put the charge through on a card belonging to a company that was literally teetering on the edge of complete insolvency. She thought she was flexing her power. She had no idea she was signing her own financial death warrant. I reached for the mouse, but I did not alter a completed contract after the fact. Aura Estates automatically generated an enhanced risk rider whenever a corporate card triggered an insolvency warning. I opened the pending agreement and selected the strictest version permitted under the resort's published commercial booking policy. The rider removed the ordinary 30-day grace period and classified any written or recorded refusal to pay the outstanding balance as a material payment default. The system immediately sent the revised contract to both Brittany and Cameron. Brittany's phone chimed before she reached the front doors. She glanced at the screen and groaned at the pages of legal language and pressed "accept all terms" without reading. Because the reservation was being made in Cameron's company name, the software then required confirmation from an authorized officer. Cameron approved it from his own phone less than a minute later, using the company's registered digital signature. Only after both approvals appeared did I lock the agreement with my executive encryption key. The $50,000 deposit was captured successfully, leaving a scheduled balance of $200,000 before any later upgrades. Neither of them noticed the rider identifying Aura Estates as a wholly owned affiliate of Vanguard Holdings. They had not merely reserved a ballroom. They had placed a new, documented corporate obligation inside the same financial network already holding their distressed debt. I downloaded the completed audit trail, Brittany's acceptance, Cameron's corporate signature, the deposit confirmation, and the version of the rider attached at the moment of execution. Every page carried a timestamp. Every approval had been voluntarily submitted. My mother had once set a table for 12 and left me outside in the cold. Now the entire family was coming into my house under terms they had accepted themselves. I leaned back from the terminal as the reservation changed from pending to binding. The snare was legal documented and entirely powered by their own arrogance. The next few weeks passed with a quiet, predictable rhythm. I went about my daily routines, overseeing the operations of Aura Estates while simultaneously managing the broader portfolio of Vanguard Holdings. Outwardly, I was the picture of calm, professional focus. Inwardly, I was counting down the hours. 2 days before the grand vow renewal, the crisp Napa Valley air was disrupted by the low, synchronized hum of heavy engines. I stood near the center of the main lobby, holding a leather-bound clipboard that contained the final security and staffing manifest for the weekend. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass doors, I watched a fleet of 6 gleaming black luxury sport utility vehicles pull into the circular driveway. The valet team rushed forward, opening doors with practiced efficiency. It was a spectacular show of wealth, deliberately orchestrated to intimidate and impress. I watched as the chauffeurs stepped out, adjusting their ties before opening the passenger doors. I already knew exactly how much those rental vehicles cost per day, down to the premium insurance waivers, and I also knew that the charge had pushed Cameron's corporate credit account dangerously close to its absolute limit. The heavy doors slid open, and the chaotic energy of my estranged family spilled into my peaceful resort. My father Thomas walked in first. He wore a crisp, tailored suit that looked brand new. His chest puffed out as he surveyed the grand chandelier and the sweeping marble staircase. He nodded approvingly, carrying himself with the unearned arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him its finest offerings. Right beside him was my mother Beatrice. She was draped in a light cream cashmere coat, her hair styled to absolute perfection. She was gesturing wildly, speaking in a loud, performative tone to a group of older, distinguished-looking men walking just behind her and Cameron. These were the elite investors Cameron was so desperately trying to court. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the edges of my clipboard. I watched Beatrice glide across the Italian marble floor, pointing out the architectural details to the investors as if she had personally commissioned the building. She turned her head to signal for a bellhop, and that was when her gaze snagged on me. For a fraction of a second, Beatrice froze. Her eyes widened, processing the sight of her youngest daughter standing in the lobby of a luxury resort holding a clipboard. But the shock did not last. It was instantly replaced by a wide, predatory smile, her eyes lit up with a malicious, triumphant gleam. She broke away from the group of investors and marched directly toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the stone floor. Thomas followed close behind, his brow furrowing as he recognized me. Beatrice did not bother to lower her voice. She wanted an audience. "Well, well, well," Beatrice announced, her voice carrying across the quiet lobby, drawing the attention of the investors and several other guests. "Look what the cat dragged in. I should have known you would end up as a glorified receptionist." I kept my posture relaxed and my expression entirely neutral. "Welcome to Aura Estates," I said, my tone perfectly polite and even. Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh that grated against my ears. She turned back to look at Cameron and the wealthy investors, making sure they were all watching the spectacle. "This is my youngest daughter, gentlemen. The family disappointment. She ran away from home years ago because she thought she was too good for us. I told her she was making a terrible mistake." Beatrice turned her piercing gaze back to me, looking me up and down with exaggerated pity. "If you had just married that mechanic we found for you, instead of trying to play businesswoman in the city, you would not be standing here hauling luggage and taking orders from people like us. Look at you, 33 years old and working the front desk." Thomas stepped up beside her, crossing his arms over his chest. He shook his head, a gesture of profound theatrical disappointment. "We tried to teach you the value of hard work, Jasmine, but you always had your head in the clouds. I suppose this is what happens when you refuse to listen to your parents. You end up fetching towels for the people who actually made something of themselves." The investors shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. It was deeply inappropriate to humiliate a service worker in such a public manner, let alone one's own flesh and blood. But Cameron simply smirked, clearly enjoying the display of dominance. Beatrice leaned in closer to me, her voice dropping slightly but retaining all of its venomous authority. "Since you are already on the clock, you can make yourself useful. Our family requires a dedicated personal concierge for the duration of this weekend. You will handle all of our requests personally. You will coordinate our dining times, manage the spa bookings, and ensure my suite is kept in pristine condition. And right now you can start by taking these bags up to our rooms." She snapped her fingers at the nearest bellhop cart, which was loaded heavily with designer suitcases and a massive, cumbersome set of professional golf clubs belonging to Thomas. She was ordering me to perform manual labor in front of the men Cameron needed to impress. It was the ultimate power play. "Of course," I replied, my voice chillingly obedient. "I would be happy to personally assist you with your luggage. Please enjoy the welcome champagne in the lounge while I ensure your suites are prepared to your exact specifications." Beatrice smiled, thoroughly satisfied with my submission. She linked arms with an investor, leading the group toward the bar with a triumphant toss of her head. I walked to the brass luggage cart. The golf clubs were incredibly heavy, digging uncomfortably into my shoulder as I hauled it off the rack. I balanced the clubs and gripped the cart's handle, pushing the heavy load across the lobby toward the restricted service elevators. As soon as the heavy metal doors of the service elevator slid shut, sealing me inside the quiet, metallic cabin, the subservient, polite expression vanished from my face. I dropped the heavy golf clubs onto the floor with a loud, unceremonious thud, not caring if the expensive drivers clattered against the metal walls. The time for playing the obedient, forgotten daughter was officially over. I set my clipboard down on top of a hard-shell suitcase and reached into the inner pocket of my blazer. I pulled out my secure, encrypted executive tablet. My family had just connected their personal devices to the resort's guest network. What they did not realize was that the entire network infrastructure was routed through Vanguard Holdings' proprietary security servers. I bypassed the standard firewall and accessed the active network traffic logs. I isolated the media access control address for Cameron's primary business smartphone. I initiated a deep, silent scan of his incoming and outgoing encrypted traffic. If he was desperate enough to bring these investors here on a maxed-out credit card, he was hiding something massive. I stood in the rising elevator, watching lines of intercepted data begin to scroll rapidly down my screen, ready to uncover the exact devastating truth of why they were really here. The smooth hum of the private lift carried me away from the chaotic energy of my family and up toward the sanctuary of the executive penthouse. When the doors slid silently open, I stepped into my true domain. The penthouse suite spanned the entire top floor, featuring wraparound glass walls, offering an unobstructed view of the rolling vineyards. The space was an immaculate blend of modern design and warm, natural materials, a stark contrast to the threadbare thrift store clothes I had worn the night my mother sent me out into the freezing cold. I walked slowly across the thick plush carpet and headed straight for the massive solid walnut desk that dominated the very center of the spacious room. I sat down in my high-backed leather chair, setting the tablet securely in its docking station. I brought up the full financial analysis tools on my main dual monitors. The initial scan I had run in the elevator had only scratched the surface. Now, with the full processing power of Vanguard Holdings at my fingertips, I could dig deep into the encrypted files Cameron had been accessing on the resort network. I bypassed his flimsy personal security measures with ease. He had no idea he had just walked into a digital fortress built and controlled by the very woman he and his wife so deeply despised. As the decrypted files populated on my screens, the sheer magnitude of Cameron's financial ruin came into sharp focus. I scrolled through internal company emails, desperate messages to private lenders, and urgent notices from corporate accountants. Cameron was unequivocally bankrupt. His holding company was a hollow shell. Every single line of credit was maxed out to the absolute limit. His commercial real estate properties were heavily mortgaged, his liquid cash reserves were completely depleted, and he was operating on high-interest bridge loans just to keep the lights on. He was drowning in a massive ocean of inescapable toxic debt. I opened another set of intercepted emails exchanged between Cameron and his chief financial officer just hours before they arrived at my resort. The messages outlined the true, desperate purpose of this ridiculous spectacle. The $250,000 vow renewal was nothing more than a carefully staged theatrical performance. It was a smoke and mirrors show designed exclusively to create a false facade of immense wealth. The target of this elaborate deception was Mr. Gallagher, the billionaire investor who had walked into the lobby right behind my mother. Cameron needed Mr. Gallagher to believe his company was thriving flush with capital and perfectly positioned for a massive cash injection. Cameron was hoping to use this weekend of forced luxury to secure a multi-million-dollar bailout investment from Gallagher to save him from total financial annihilation. I leaned back, staring at the glowing monitors, absorbing the profound irony. Brittany had stood in my lobby, dripping in expensive jewelry and mocking my supposed failure, while her husband was one missed payment away from losing every single thing they owned. They were throwing a massive party on a credit card that was moments away from declining, all to desperately trick a billionaire into saving them from the inevitable consequences of their own reckless greed. But the most devastating piece of information was still waiting to be uncovered. I needed to know exactly who currently held the notes on Cameron's massive mountain of toxic debt. If he was this close to default, someone was getting ready to seize his assets. I ran a targeted search through the global banking database, tracing the primary loans that were dragging his holding company under. When the result flashed onto my screen, I actually stopped breathing for a moment. I had to read the name of the acquiring institution 3 times to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. The regional bank that had originally issued Cameron's commercial loans had gone through a restructuring phase last quarter. To clear their books of high-risk liabilities, they had bundled a massive portfolio of distressed corporate debt and sold it off to a larger, much more aggressive asset management firm. The exact name of the firm that had purchased that exact debt portfolio was Vanguard Asset Holdings. A quiet realization settled over me. Vanguard Holdings was the parent company I had built from nothing, and Aura Estates was one of its wholly owned properties. Vanguard Asset Holdings was the specialized subsidiary that purchased distressed loans. The names were different because their functions were different, but I controlled both entities outright. The debt suffocating Cameron the notes secured by his properties, and the enforcement rights attached to those notes, now sat inside my corporate structure. I owned the resort where he was staging his false display of wealth, and my company owned the obligations that could dismantle that display. My mother had once banished me to the Porch because she believed I lacked the status to sit beside Cameron's family. Now the son-in-law she worshipped depended on an empire built by the daughter she had discarded. I opened the original loan agreements and found the clause that made the new resort obligation dangerous. Cameron's holding company had agreed that a material default owed to Vanguard Holdings or any wholly owned Vanguard affiliate would constitute a cross default under its commercial notes. Aura Estates was one of those affiliates. The threshold was $250,000, and the event's total contracted value already met it. The guarantor's schedule revealed an equally important name: Thomas Wilson. Years earlier, eager to claim credit for Cameron's expansion, my father had personally guaranteed the loans and pledged part of his investment portfolio and 2 commercial properties as additional collateral. His signature appeared on every amendment. If Cameron's company formally repudiated the event, Vanguard could accelerate the outstanding notes, seek emergency restrictions on pledged accounts, and begin enforcement against collateral supplied by both men. A separate covenant required Cameron to notify the lender immediately if his company became unable or unwilling to satisfy any material obligation when due. His internal emails proved that he already knew the company lacked the cash to pay the final resort balance. His plan to hide the invoice until Tuesday was not an innocent request for administrative convenience. It was an attempt to conceal a condition the loan documents required him to disclose. I highlighted one limitation before doing anything else. Thomas could not trigger the clause merely by shouting on Cameron's behalf. The refusal had to come from Cameron himself, acting as the company's authorized signatory, and it had to be preserved in a form counsel could verify. Until that happened, the dossier was leverage, not an execution order. I would need his voice, his title, the exact balance, and an unambiguous declaration that his company would not pay. I did not need to invent a loophole or manufacture a default. The mechanism had existed for years, drafted by attorneys Cameron and Thomas had paid and ignored. All I needed was to let their pride place the final fact into the record. I printed the guarantor pages, the cross-default covenant, the disclosure requirement, and the transfer documents proving that Vanguard Asset Holdings, the debt acquisition subsidiary of my parent company, Vanguard Holdings, now controlled the loans. When the printer stopped the legal path from one refused resort invoice to the enforcement of Cameron's larger debt was no longer an assumption. It was sitting in my hands, page by page. I had the legal right to completely dismantle their fake, arrogant lives. They had brought their fragile house of cards into a hurricane, and I was the one controlling the wind. I reached over to my private printer and selected the most damning documents from the intercepted data packet. I printed the internal memos proving his insolvency, the frantic emails to his accountants, and the official transfer documents proving Vanguard Asset Holdings was the sole owner of his defaulted loans. The printer hummed quietly, spitting out page after page of undeniable leverage. When the printing was complete, I gathered the warm sheets of paper and tapped them neatly against the desk. I slid the thick stack of evidence into a sleek, unmarked black leather folder. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my simple navy blue blazer. I was no longer just the resort owner watching from the shadows. I was the executioner, and it was time to step back down onto the floor and play my assigned role as the obedient, lowly concierge. I left the penthouse and took the elevator back down to the main floor, the heavy black folder tucked securely under my arm. I walked down the carpeted hallway that led toward the private meeting rooms, my face composed into a mask of professional neutrality. I was heading toward the front desk to check the evening manifests when a sudden movement caught my eye. A heavy door to one of the private alcoves cracked open. Before I could react, a large, sweaty hand shot out from the shadows. The hand grabbed my upper arm with a bruising, desperate grip. I was yanked forcefully out of the brightly lit hallway and pulled into the dim, secluded space of the alcove. I stumbled slightly, quickly catching my balance as the heavy wooden door was pushed tightly shut behind me, completely cutting off the sounds of the resort. I looked up, my grip tightening on the black folder. Standing right in front of me, breathing heavily and looking completely frantic, was Cameron. His expensive suit jacket was unbuttoned, his tie was loosened, and a visible sheen of cold sweat coated his pale forehead. He looked absolutely terrified, his frantic eyes darting wildly around the small, dim room. The air in the narrow alcove felt heavy with the scent of nervous perspiration and expensive cologne. I took a slow breath, forcing my heart rate to remain steady. I did not pull away. I simply stood there, my posture perfectly straight, holding the black leather folder securely against my side. Inside that folder was the absolute proof of his financial ruin. And yet here he was, treating me like a disposable pawn in a game he had already lost. Cameron swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his collar. He ran a trembling hand through his thinning hair, completely ruining the carefully styled look he had presented in the lobby just hours ago. He leaned in closer. "You have to listen to me," Cameron whispered aggressively, his voice a raw, grating sound that barely resembled his usual booming corporate tone. "I know we do not have the best history. I know Brittany can be difficult, but I need you to do exactly what I say right now, and I need you to do it without asking any questions." I looked at him, my expression a carefully constructed mask of professional neutrality. I let the silence stretch out between us for a few agonizing seconds, watching the desperation mount in his wide, bloodshot eyes. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his expensive leather shoes squeaking faintly against the polished hardwood floor. "How can I assist you, Cameron?" I asked, keeping my tone flawlessly polite and entirely devoid of emotion. He let out a shaky breath, glancing over his shoulder at the heavy wooden door to ensure it was completely shut. "It is about the billing for the vow renewal." He stammered the words tumbling out of his mouth in a hurried rush. "The front desk has this massive, ridiculous invoice for the weekend. I know how these luxury resorts work. They print out preliminary folios and leave them at the reception desk for the guests to review, or they slip them under the doors on the final night. He paused, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His chest heaved with shallow, rapid breaths. I cannot let that happen. You cannot let that happen. Do you understand me? He demanded, his fingers twitching nervously at his sides. Mr. Gallagher and the other investors are going to be mingling near the reception area. If they see a physical invoice, or if anyone from your billing department approaches me about settling the account while they are within earshot, it will ruin everything. It will absolutely destroy the atmosphere of the weekend. I maintained my steady, unbroken gaze. He was not worried about the atmosphere. He was terrified that the billionaire investors would realize he did not have the capital to pay for his own party. He was terrified the resort staff would publicly demand payment on a declined credit card, shattering the elaborate illusion of wealth he had so painstakingly constructed. It is standard procedure to present the final folio prior to departure, I stated evenly, playing the role of the diligent employee perfectly. The accounting department requires all balances to be settled before guests conclude their stay. I do not care about your standard procedures. Cameron hissed his voice, taking on a desperate, pleading edge. I am telling you to bypass them. You have access to the front desk. I saw you using the computer earlier. I need you to go into the system and bury the invoice. Hide it. Delete the preliminary printouts. Do whatever you have to do to make sure that bill does not see the light of day until next Tuesday. He reached into his tailored slacks, his hand shaking violently as he pulled out a thick silver money clip. He fumbled with the clasp, his slick fingers struggling to separate the bills. He finally managed to pull out a single crumpled $500 bill. He thrust his hand forward and shoved the crumpled money aggressively into the front pocket of my uniform blazer. The sheer audacity of the gesture was almost comical. Listen to me, he whispered, stepping so close I could feel the heat radiating from his panicked body. I need you to hide the final invoice from the front desk until next Tuesday. Do not let the investors see the bill under any circumstances. Just delay it in the system. Tell accounting there was a glitch. Tell them I requested a delayed corporate billing cycle. Make up a story. Just ensure the invoice is handled exactly as requested, and there will be more money in it for you when I secure my new funding round. I looked down at the crumpled green bill sticking out of my pocket. $500. He was attempting to bribe me with $500 to conceal a $250,000 fraudulent charge. He was trying to buy my silence with pocket change, while simultaneously owing my asset management firm tens of millions of dollars in defaulted loans. The profound, staggering irony of the moment washed over me, settling deep into my chest. I felt a cold, hard sense of satisfaction taking root. He had no idea that the woman he was bribing could buy his entire life 1,000 times over. He had no idea that the black folder resting against my hip contained the legal documents that would finalize his total financial annihilation. I reached into my pocket with slow, deliberate movements. I pinched the edge of the crumpled $500 bill between my index finger and thumb, pulling it out into the dim light of the alcove. I held it up for a moment, examining the wrinkled paper as if it were a strange foreign object. Cameron watched my hands with bated breath, clearly believing he had just successfully purchased my loyalty. He let out a long, shaky sigh of relief, his rigid posture finally beginning to slacken. Without breaking eye contact, I turned slightly toward a small, decorative housekeeping cart that had been temporarily parked in the corner of the alcove. Resting on the bottom shelf of the cart was a small glass tip jar intended for the cleaning staff. I extended my arm and casually dropped the crumpled $500 bill into the jar. I turned my attention back to Cameron. My face was a mask of absolute, chilling obedience. I will ensure the invoice is handled exactly as requested, I said, my voice mechanical and perfectly polite. The relief that flooded Cameron's face was palpable. The tension drained from his shoulders, and he wiped his forehead one last time with a shaking hand. He genuinely believed his pathetic bribe had worked. He believed he had secured the extra time he needed to manipulate Mr. Gallagher into signing away millions. "Good," he muttered, adjusting his tie and smoothing the lapels of his suit jacket. "See that you do. Your cooperation will not be forgotten." He turned around, grabbed the brass handle of the heavy wooden door, and pulled it open. He stepped back out into the brightly lit, carpeted hallway of the resort, taking a deep breath of the fresh, eucalyptus-scented air. He squared his shoulders, plastered a confident fake smile back onto his face, and strode purposefully down the corridor, ready to return to his wealthy investors and continue playing the role of a highly successful, thriving corporate titan. I remained in the shadows of the alcove for a few moments longer, adjusting my grip on the black leather folder. The trap was holding perfectly. Cameron had just handed me the final piece of rope he needed to hang himself. He wanted the invoice delayed until Tuesday. He wanted me to bypass the standard accounting procedures. I would do exactly as he requested, but not in the way he intended. I would ensure the invoice bypassed the front desk completely and went straight to the default and seizure department of Vanguard Holdings. I stepped out of the dim alcove and back into the elegant, sunlit hallway. The corridor was relatively quiet, the thick carpets absorbing the sound of my footsteps. I began walking back toward the main reception area to finalize the evening manifests. As I passed a massive, ornate marble pillar near the entrance to the grand ballroom, a sudden movement caught my eye. A figure stepped out from behind the cold stone blocking my path. It was Brittany. She was wearing a form-fitting emerald green dress, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her perfectly manicured nails were digging into her own skin, leaving angry red half-moons on her arms. She had been standing there the entire time. She had witnessed Cameron pulling me into the private, secluded alcove. She had watched the heavy wooden door close behind us, leaving us alone in the dim light. And she had seen the hushed, secretive exchange as Cameron hurriedly shoved the crumpled $500 bill into my pocket, before walking away, with a look of profound relief on his face. Brittany's eyes were narrowed into dark, dangerous slits. The smug, arrogant superiority she had displayed in the lobby earlier was completely gone. In its place was a burning, destructive rage. Her jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle twitched near her ear. She looked at me, and her eyes burned with pure, unadulterated venom. She had completely misunderstood the entire interaction, and that misunderstanding was about to set the entire resort on fire. I did not stop to correct her. I simply maintained my steady, measured pace, walking right past the marble pillar where she stood fuming. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, completely ignoring the intense, burning glare she was directing at the side of my face. Engaging with Brittany when she was in a state of blind rage had always been a losing battle, and I had absolutely no intention of playing her twisted games anymore. I had real work to do, and a meticulously crafted snare to monitor. I continued down the long, carpeted corridor, turning the corner and pushing through the heavy double doors that led into the restricted employees' service area. The staff break room at Aura Estates was a stark contrast to the opulent, sunlit public spaces of the resort. It was a highly functional, windowless room, filled with gleaming stainless steel counters, industrial refrigerators, and the constant low hum of vending machines. I walked over to one of the large circular tables in the center of the room and set my black leather folder down. I pulled out the detailed event seating charts for the upcoming vow renewal. I needed to cross-reference the final guest list against our internal security protocols, ensuring that Mr. Gallagher and his wealthy associates were positioned exactly where I needed them to be for the upcoming spectacle. The room was mostly empty at this hour, offering a brief moment of quiet sanctuary. I leaned over the large sheets of paper, tracing the intricate table arrangements with a red pen, my mind calculating the final moves of my strategy. The heavy double doors of the break room suddenly burst open with a violent, deafening crash. The metal handle slammed against the drywall, leaving a noticeable dent in the pristine plaster. I looked up, startled by the sudden noise. Brittany stormed into the room, her emerald green designer dress swishing aggressively around her legs. She had bypassed several restricted access signs to get here, driven by a blind, destructive fury. Her face was flushed, a deep, blotchy crimson, and her chest was heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. She marched directly toward my table, her high heels slamming against the practical linoleum floor like gunshots. Before I could even open my mouth to ask what she was doing in an employee-only area, she lunged toward the stainless steel counter to her right. A large, clear glass pitcher filled with ice water and sliced lemons sat near the coffee station, prepared for the staff's afternoon shift. Brittany grabbed the heavy pitcher by its thick glass handle. With a guttural sound of pure, unhinged rage, she swung her arm in a wide, vicious arc. A freezing, violent wave of ice water crashed directly into my face. The sheer shock of the freezing liquid stole the breath right out of my lungs. Heavy cubes of ice struck my forehead and shoulders, clattering noisily onto the table and bouncing across the linoleum floor. The cold water soaked instantly through my simple navy blue blazer, chilling my skin and dripping down my neck in freezing rivulets. The wet lemon slices plastered themselves against the paper of my seating charts, instantly ruining the meticulous diagrams I had been reviewing. I stood frozen for a fraction of a second, water dripping from my eyelashes and running down the bridge of my nose. I blinked against the stinging cold, looking through my soaked hair at the woman standing on the other side of the table. Brittany slammed the empty glass pitcher down onto the steel counter so hard I was surprised it did not shatter into 1,000 pieces. "Stay away from my husband, you desperate loser!" Brittany screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the hard walls of the break room. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "I saw you. I saw exactly what you were doing in that dark hallway. Do you honestly think I am stupid? Do you think I do not know what a pathetic, gold-digging tramp looks like?" I took a slow, deep breath, letting the freezing water drip from my chin onto the collar of my shirt. I did not raise my hands to wipe my face. I did not flinch. I just stood there, absorbing the absolute absurdity of her accusations. "You have always been jealous of me," Brittany continued, her voice rising in pitch, completely unmoored from reality. "You have always hated the fact that I got out, that I married a highly successful, wealthy man, while you were busy scrubbing floors and living in poverty. And now you think you can just slither back into our lives and seduce him for cash? I saw him hand you that money. I saw you take it. You are literally prostituting yourself in a storage closet because you are so desperate for a taste of my perfect life." The projection was so massive, so entirely detached from the truth, that it almost defied logic. She truly believed her husband was a wealthy titan of industry, fending off the advances of a desperate, impoverished sister. She had absolutely no idea that her perfect life was built on a crumbling foundation of toxic debt, and that the man she was defending had just attempted to bribe me with pocket change to hide their impending bankruptcy. She was defending a ghost, a hollow illusion of wealth that was already dead. "I could have you arrested right now," Brittany hissed, leaning over the table, her face mere inches from mine. "I could call the police and have you thrown in jail for extortion. I could tell the general manager of this resort that you are soliciting guests for money. You would be fired, disgraced, and thrown right back out onto the street where you belong. I will completely destroy you, Jasmine. I will ruin whatever pathetic little life you have managed to scrape together." She paused, breathing heavily, waiting for my reaction. She was waiting for me to cry. She was waiting for me to drop to my knees, beg for her forgiveness, and promise to leave her fake, glittering world alone. She wanted the satisfaction of watching me break, just like I had broken on that freezing Thanksgiving night 9 years ago. But I was not that broken girl anymore. I did not feel fear. I did not feel shame. I felt an immense, towering sense of calm. I slowly reached across the table and pulled a single dry paper napkin from the plastic dispenser near the coffee machine. With deliberate, agonizingly slow movements, I blotted the freezing water from my eyes and forehead. I wiped my cheeks, folding the damp napkin neatly into a perfect square. I placed the folded napkin down on the table next to the ruined seating charts. I looked directly into Brittany's dark, furious eyes. My expression was perfectly stoic, completely empty of the terror she was so desperately trying to provoke. "Brittany?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a weight that made the air in the room feel dense. "This is an employee-only area. For your own safety and to avoid any unnecessary disruptions to your scheduled events, I must respectfully ask you to leave this room immediately." Brittany stared at me, her mouth falling slightly open in profound shock. The absolute lack of fear in my voice, the complete absence of the panic she had expected, seemed to short-circuit her brain. She looked at my calm, unbothered face, and the realization that she had failed to intimidate me sent a new, far more dangerous wave of anger rushing through her veins. The petty satisfaction of throwing water in my face was no longer enough. Her chest heaved, her hands balling into tight fists at her sides. "You think you can just dismiss me?" she whispered, her voice shaking with a dark, concentrated rage. "You think you can just stand there and act like you are better than me? I am going to make you regret the day you were born." She turned on her heel, her expensive dress swishing violently as she marched back toward the heavy double doors. She shoved them open with brutal force and disappeared down the carpeted hallway without looking back. I stood alone in the quiet break room, listening to the faint hum of the vending machines return to the silent space. I looked down at my ruined seating chart, and a small, cold smile slowly forming on my lips. Brittany was enraged by my absolute lack of fear. Getting me fired was clearly no longer enough to satisfy her bruised ego. She wanted to ruin me legally. She wanted to obliterate me entirely. And in her desperate, blinding rage, I knew she was about to make a catastrophic mistake that would seal her family's fate forever. I remained in the break room after the door swung shut. The chilled water soaking into my blazer matched the cold determination settling in my chest. Brittany wanted to destroy my life because she believed I was a threat to her carefully constructed illusion of success. Her violent outburst was the desperate, flailing reaction of a woman who felt her control slipping away. I dried the last drops of water from my collar, gathered my ruined seating charts, and exited through the rear service door. It was time to return to my penthouse office and monitor the digital perimeter of my resort. Meanwhile, out in the opulent main lobby, Brittany was pacing like a caged animal. She had stormed out of the employee area with her blood boiling, searching for a way to enact immediate, devastating revenge. Her ego had been bruised, her authority challenged by the very person she had spent her entire life stepping on. She needed to reassert her dominance, and she needed to do it in a way that would guarantee my absolute ruin. She wandered near the massive marble reception desk, her eyes darting around the polished space. The front desk was temporarily unstaffed. The concierge team was busy coordinating luggage deliveries for the sudden influx of high-profile guests, and the remaining receptionists had stepped into the back office. Sitting unguarded on the far end of the marble counter was a sleek computer terminal. It was a standard employee workstation used for managing guest requests and checking event itineraries. I had walked away from that exact terminal earlier, leaving the standard operating screen active. I knew the security protocols of Aura Estates intimately, which meant I also knew exactly what a determined, malicious person could attempt to do if left alone with an open system. Brittany stopped pacing. She looked around the expansive lobby, confirming that no one was watching her. The wealthy investors were still sequestered in the lounge area, sipping their complimentary champagne, and her husband Cameron was nowhere to be seen. She stepped closer to the marble counter, her emerald green dress rustling softly against the stone. She leaned over the polished surface, her eyes locking onto the glowing monitor of the unattended workstation. The screen displayed a basic employee dashboard, showing the upcoming schedule for the grand ballroom and the associated billing folios. Brittany's mind raced with spiteful, vindictive possibilities. She had just accused me of soliciting her husband for cash. She had threatened to have me fired and thrown out on the street. But a simple firing was no longer sufficient for her. She wanted me humiliated, disgraced, and facing criminal charges. She wanted to ensure I could never work in the hospitality industry, or any industry ever again. She needed a crime, and she decided she was going to manufacture one right then and there. She remembered something she had witnessed earlier in the day. When she was initially demanding a massive family discount upon her arrival, she had watched one of the senior shift managers authorize a complimentary room upgrade for another guest. She had stood close enough to see the manager type a generic 6-digit override code into the system to bypass the billing lock. It was a simple numeric sequence used for minor day-to-day guest accommodations. Brittany reached across the counter and placed her manicured fingers on the keyboard. She navigated to the master event folio for Cameron's holding company. The screen brought up the massive $250,000 balance for the upcoming vow renewal. Brittany clicked on the Amenities and Upgrades tab. A malicious, triumphant smile spread across her face as she began to type. She was going to frame me for massive corporate theft and enjoy the spoils in the process. First, she accessed the beverage menu for the private investor dinner. She deleted the standard wine packages and replaced them with 12 bottles of the most exclusive vintage champagne the resort kept in its subterranean cellars. Next, she navigated to the catering manifest and added rare imported caviar to the hors d'oeuvre list for all 200 guests attending the grand ballroom reception. Finally, she opened the Wellness Center tab and booked extended premium spa services for herself, her mother, and 5 of her closest friends. The total cost of these unauthorized upgrades amounted to exactly $75,000. The system prompted her for an authorization signature to add the massive charge to the final invoice. Brittany did not hesitate. She typed in the 6-digit override code she had memorized from the shift manager. The system accepted the code, but it required a corresponding employee identification number to finalize the approval and process the routing. Brittany knew my full name, and she knew the basic employee directory format from her time snooping around the desk earlier. She typed my name into the authorization field, deliberately routing the massive, fraudulent $75,000 approval directly under my employee profile. She hit the Enter key with a sharp, decisive strike. The screen flashed green, confirming that the luxury upgrades had been successfully added to the holding company's folio and authorized by the front desk concierge. Brittany stepped back from the terminal, her heart racing with the thrill of her own brilliant sabotage. In her mind, she had just orchestrated the perfect crime. When the resort management inevitably audited the event and discovered $75,000 in unauthorized luxury upgrades, the digital paper trail would point directly to me. I would be accused of stealing from the resort to give my estranged family a lavish experience. I would be arrested for grand larceny, and she would get to drink vintage champagne while watching me be hauled away in handcuffs. High above the lobby, in the absolute silence of the executive penthouse, I had just finished changing out of my damp blazer and into a fresh white silk blouse. I walked over to my massive walnut desk and sat down in my leather chair. I was reaching for my coffee cup when my secure, encrypted smartphone suddenly vibrated violently against the wood surface. A harsh, high-pitched chime cut through the quiet room. I picked up the device. The screen was flashing with a bright red Level 1 security alert. This was not a standard notification. This was a critical system warning triggered by the proprietary financial software that governed Vanguard Holdings and all of its subsidiary properties. The alert indicated that an unauthorized massive financial override had just been executed on a flagged high-risk account. I unlocked my phone and opened the live security monitoring application. The software instantly mirrored the exact screen of the lobby terminal Brittany was using. I sat back in my chair, resting my chin on my hand, and watched the live keystrokes populate on my display in real time. I watched as the $75,000 in vintage champagne, rare caviar, and premium spa services were added to the doomed corporate folio. I watched the override code being entered. And then I watched as my own name was typed into the authorization field, explicitly framing me for the massive theft. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated victory. Brittany thought she was being clever. She thought she was manipulating a simple hotel booking software. She had no idea she was interacting with a highly monitored, federally compliant financial network owned by an asset management firm. By overriding the system to add fraudulent charges to a bankrupt holding company's account, she was not just committing a petty, vindictive prank against a sister. She had just crossed state lines on a corporate network to alter debt structures. She was committing federal wire fraud, and she was doing it live on my secure servers. I did not rush downstairs to stop her. I simply tapped a few buttons on my smartphone, initiating a complete, unalterable download of the terminal's IP logs, the exact timestamps, and the recorded keystroke data. I transferred the pristine digital evidence directly into my highly encrypted corporate vault, locking it behind multiple layers of biometric security. The final piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. The snare had not just closed around them. They had locked it themselves and handed me the key. I remained in the absolute silence of my executive penthouse for a few moments longer, letting the magnitude of Brittany's foolishness settle over me. She had handed me a federal crime on a silver platter. I locked my workstation, ensuring the digital vault containing her keystroke logs and IP data was heavily encrypted and backed up to multiple off-site servers. I stood up from my heavy walnut desk and smoothed the front of my simple navy blue blazer. There was no time to sit and savor this quiet victory just yet. The evening was quickly approaching, and the most critical performance of the entire weekend was about to begin. The pre-vow renewal investor dinner was scheduled for 7 o'clock sharp, and I had a very specific role to play. I took the private elevator back down to the main floor and made my way toward the resort's exclusive dining wing. The private glass dining room at Aura Estates is an architectural masterpiece designed specifically to awe and intimidate. Suspended over the very edge of our oldest vineyard, it features seamless floor-to-ceiling windows that offer a breathtaking panoramic view of the rolling Napa Valley hills as the sun sets. Inside the room, a massive custom-built mahogany table had been meticulously set for 20 of Cameron's most elite guests. Elaborate crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the imported bone china, the heavy silver flatware, and the towering centerpieces of white roses and trailing ivy. I stood quietly near the polished wooden service station in the corner of the room, holding a crisp white linen towel over my forearm, and observed the gathering storm. Cameron was already there, pacing nervously near the head of the long table. Despite the immaculate, perfectly balanced climate control in the room, a thin layer of nervous sweat coated his pale forehead. He kept checking his expensive, heavy silver watch, shooting anxious, darting glances toward the thick oak double doors. He looked exactly like a man standing blindfolded on the edge of a steep cliff, desperately hoping the wind would not blow. He needed this dinner to go absolutely perfectly. He needed these high-profile investors to look at the extravagant setting, taste the expensive food, and see a thriving, untouchable corporate titan, rather than the bankrupt, fraudulent failure who was secretly drowning in a sea of toxic debt. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy oak doors swung open. The investors began to arrive in small, hushed groups. They moved into the room, exuding the quiet, effortless, and unshakable confidence of people who possessed deep generational wealth. Among them was Mr. Gallagher, the billionaire, holding the financial purse strings that Cameron so desperately needed to grasp. Mr. Gallagher was a shrewd, highly observant man in his late 60s. He was legendary in the financial sector for his ruthless business acumen and his absolute unyielding intolerance for deception or incompetence. Beatrice drifted into the dining room right behind Mr. Gallagher. She was draped in a flowing emerald silk dress, wearing a diamond necklace that caught the chandelier light and sporting a smile so bright and forced it looked painful. My father Thomas and my sister Brittany followed closely behind, her perfectly playing the roles of the affluent, untouchable family. Brittany looked particularly smug as she took her seat, likely still riding the high of her fraudulent computer sabotage in the lobby, completely unaware that she had just signed her own financial death warrant. Beatrice took her seat near the very center of the long mahogany table, positioning herself perfectly to hold court over the wealthiest guests. As the first course of delicate appetizer plates was cleared away by my highly trained catering staff, Beatrice's sharp eyes darted around the room. She spotted me, standing quietly by the service station in the corner. The familiar, malicious, and degrading gleam instantly returned to her eyes. She raised her hand and snapped her fingers sharply. The loud, demanding sound cut right through the polite murmurs of the wealthy guests. She gestured aggressively for me to come over to the table. I walked slowly toward her, keeping my posture flawless and my expression entirely blank. I stopped just behind Beatrice's plush dining chair. She did not even bother to look up at me when she spoke. Instead, she leaned slightly forward toward Mr. Gallagher, who was seated directly across the table from her. It is so incredibly difficult to find good, reliable help these days, Beatrice announced, her voice pitched perfectly to ensure that entire section of the long table could hear every word. You really have to supervise them constantly, or they ruin everything. She turned her head slightly to address me, her tone dripping with absolute contempt. You there. Bring the reserve Cabernet from the cellar, and I want you to pour it for my guests, personally. Try not to spill a single drop on anyone's suit. These garments cost more money than you make in an entire year. Cameron actually flinched slightly at her harsh tone, looking terrified that her blatant arrogance might offend the sensitive investors. But he remained silent, too cowardly to intervene. I gave a small, polite, mechanical nod. I retrieved a heavy, dust-covered bottle of the resort's absolute finest reserve vintage, draped the white linen towel precisely over my arm, and returned to the dining table. I moved methodically down the line of seated guests, pouring the dark red wine with practiced, elegant precision. I did not spill a single drop. I kept my breathing slow and steady, allowing the quiet rhythm of the service to anchor my focus. As I approached the center of the table, I stepped up right behind Mr. Gallagher's chair. I leaned forward slightly, respectfully presenting the label of the vintage bottle before pouring the dark liquid into his wide crystal glass. Mr. Gallagher took a slow, thoughtful sip, his sharp eyes tracking my movement. He lowered the heavy glass to the table, and his gaze snagged directly on my face. For a brief, suspended moment, his expression was entirely blank. Then his sharp, intelligent eyes widened in profound, genuine shock. He stopped chewing. His large hand froze midway to the table, hovering in the air. He blinked hard, as if an impossible apparition had just materialized in the middle of this lavish dining room. "Jasmine?" he asked aloud. His deep, gravelly voice carried a tone of absolute, unmistakable bewilderment that silenced the conversations immediately around him. He leaned back in his chair, completely ignoring the other wealthy guests at the table. "Jasmine, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, what on earth are you doing holding a wine bottle in a place like this?" The entire dining table fell dead silent. The soft clinking of silver forks against bone china stopped instantly. Cammon's face drained of all color, transforming in a fraction of a second into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He looked wildly from Mr. Gallagher to me, his jaw dropping slightly as his breathing hitched. Brittany froze in her seat, her own crystal wineglass suspended rigidly near her lips, her eyes darting nervously. Before Mr. Gallagher could say another word, before he could expose the massive underlying truth of my identity to the entire room and shatter the illusion completely, Beatrice let out a loud, shrill laugh. The sudden sound was high, grating, and dripping with forced amusement and desperate condescension. "Oh, Mr. Gallagher, you are simply too funny," Beatrice said, waving her manicured hand dismissively through the air, as if brushing away a pesky insect. "I am afraid you must be mistaking her for someone important. She is certainly no executive. She is just a waitress. This is my estranged daughter, Jasmine. She is a bit delusional, you see, and she loves to tell tall tales to anyone who will listen to her. She has always had a terribly overactive imagination. Please, I beg of you, do not let her bother you." Mr. Gallagher frowned deeply, his thick eyebrows knitting together. He was clearly insulted by Beatrice's blatant attempt to correct him. He opened his mouth to argue, prepared to state definitively that he had sat directly across from me in a secure corporate boardroom just 3 months ago, negotiating a massive, highly confidential corporate merger. I did not let him speak. I stood perfectly straight, my posture rigid and commanding, and met his eyes directly across the table. I held his intense gaze with a cold, absolute focus. I gave him a very small, incredibly subtle, but absolutely commanding shake of my head. It was a microscopic, measured movement, entirely invisible to my mother, to Cameron, and to the rest of my family sitting nearby. But Mr. Gallagher caught it instantly. I watched the gears turning rapidly in his sharp billionaire mind. He looked at Beatrice's smug, arrogant, and foolish face. He looked at Cameron's sweating, terrified, and pathetic expression. And then he looked back at me, the billionaire CEO of Vanguard Holdings, standing there in a simple, unbranded blazer, pouring wine in my own multi-million-dollar luxury resort. He realized immediately that a massive, highly dangerous, and deeply personal game was afoot. He understood instantly that my family was walking blindly, arrogantly into a brutal slaughter. A slow, knowing smirk spread across Mr. Gallagher's weathered face. He picked up his crystal wine glass, swirling the dark red liquid thoughtfully as he leaned back in his chair. His eyes shone with sudden, intense, and predatory amusement. He had always appreciated a ruthless, perfectly executed corporate strategy, and he decided right then and there to play along. Mr. Gallagher smoothly transitioned back into the role of the entertained, affluent guest. He offered a polite, completely unreadable smile to Beatrice, and took another slow sip of his wine. The tense, suspended energy in the room slowly dissipated as the other investors returned to their previous conversations, entirely unaware of the silent exchange that had just occurred. I finished pouring the last glass of the reserve Cabernet, stepped back into the shadows of the service station, and watched the performance continue. The decadent main courses were eventually cleared away by my meticulous catering staff. The atmosphere in the glass dining room seemed to relax, lulled by the expensive wine and the soft ambient lighting. Servers brought out the dessert course, placing delicate spun sugar creations and rich dark chocolate truffles in front of each guest. Cameron picked up his small silver dessert fork, looking slightly more at ease now that the meal was nearing its conclusion without any major disasters. He actually managed a genuine, albeit strained, smile as he leaned toward Mr. Gallagher to initiate one final pitch for his highly anticipated capital injection. Mr. Gallagher did not let him finish his prepared opening sentence. He set his own fork down on the pristine white tablecloth and dabbed the corners of his mouth with a linen napkin. He looked directly at Cameron, his expression shifting into a mask of casual, predatory business conversation. You know, Cameron, the commercial real estate market has become incredibly volatile this past quarter. Mr. Gallagher noted, his deep voice carrying easily across the table. My firm actually just made a major strategic move to mitigate our own exposure to high-risk corporate liabilities. We offloaded a massive, highly toxic portfolio of distressed debt just last week. Cameron froze, his silver fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Is that right? He asked, trying to maintain a tone of polite professional interest. May I ask who the buyer was? Not many institutions have the liquidity to absorb a massive distressed portfolio in this current economic climate. Mr. Gallagher smiled, leaning back into the plush velvet of his chair. That is the interesting part. The buyer was a rather ruthless, incredibly efficient entity called Vanguard Asset Holdings. They swept in and acquired the entire debt structure in a single aggressive transaction. From what my analysts tell me, Vanguard is quietly absorbing several major properties and vulnerable holding companies across the state. They hold the keys to a lot of impending bankruptcies right now. The name dropped into the quiet dining room like a live grenade. Vanguard Asset Holdings. Cameron did not just freeze. His entire body seemed to seize up. He inhaled sharply, and a piece of the rich chocolate truffle went straight down his windpipe. He began to choke violently. His face instantly turned a sickening deep shade of purple as he coughed, his hands flying to his throat in genuine panic. He knocked over his crystal water glass in his frantic struggle for air, sending cold water spilling across the immaculate white tablecloth. Brittany shrieked, jumping up from her chair and slapping his back aggressively, while the other investors watched with a mixture of concern and mild disgust. Cameron finally managed to draw a ragged, wheezing breath, but his eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He knew exactly what Vanguard Asset Holdings was. He knew that Vanguard was the umbrella corporation that had recently acquired the regional bank holding his massive defaulted loans. Hearing Mr. Gallagher casually confirm that Vanguard was actively sweeping up distressed corporate debt meant that his own holding company was already in their crosshairs. The ruthless corporate entity Mr. Gallagher had just described held the keys to his impending bankruptcy and, by extension, his entire life. I apologize. Cameron gasped out, his voice a hoarse, panicked wheeze. He grabbed a napkin and wiped his watering eyes, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the fabric. I need some air. Please excuse me for just a moment. He pushed his chair back with a loud, disruptive scrape against the hardwood floor and practically sprinted out of the glass dining room. Brittany quickly excused herself and hurried after him, her emerald green dress swishing as she chased her terrified husband into the hallway. I remained at the service station watching them flee. I knew exactly where this panic would lead them. Out in the quiet, carpeted corridor, Cameron paced, frantically, running his hands through his hair. He explained the catastrophic reality to Brittany in hushed, aggressive whispers. If Vanguard Asset Holdings decided to call in his loans, they were finished. Their cars, their homes, their business accounts, everything would be seized. They desperately needed to find out who owned Vanguard, who was also the rumored owner of this very resort, Aura Estates. They needed a name, a face, or something they could use to beg for a loan extension or negotiate a settlement. Brittany's mind, always driven by entitlement and a desperate need for control, formulated a reckless plan. She needed leverage, and she needed access to the resort's restricted executive files to find it. She looked down the hallway and saw me emerging from the dining room carrying a silver tray of empty wine glasses. In her arrogant, narrow mind, I was just a lowly employee. She assumed that as a glorified member of the cleaning staff, I must have master keycards to access and clean the executive suites after hours. She marched directly toward me, her eyes locked onto the front pocket of my blazer. I saw her coming, and I knew exactly what she was intending to do. I slowed my pace slightly, making it incredibly easy for her. Brittany orchestrated a clumsy, aggressive collision. She bumped her shoulder hard into mine, feigning immense outrage as the silver tray rattled in my hands. "Watch where you are going, you clumsy idiot!" she snapped loudly, creating a harsh distraction. While she yelled at me, her quick, practiced fingers slipped seamlessly into the side pocket of my navy blue blazer. I felt the slight, distinct tug as she extracted my heavy black master executive keycard. "I am so sorry, ma'am," I apologized profusely, bowing my head and playing the part of the meek, terrified servant perfectly. "Please forgive me." Brittany scoffed, turning on her heel and storming off down the corridor. She clutched her stolen prize tightly in her hand, utterly convinced that she had just outsmarted me. She truly believed she had just secured the key to saving her husband's crumbling empire, completely unaware that I had deliberately placed the card in that pocket for her to take. As midnight approached, the sprawling luxury resort finally quietened down. The wealthy guests retreated to their suites, and the grand lobby sat empty under the dim glow of the crystal chandeliers. Brittany slipped silently out of her extravagant luxury suite, wearing dark clothing and moving with paranoid caution. She made her way to the restricted top-floor executive access elevator, located at the end of the north wing. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed the stolen black keycard against the electronic security reader. The small indicator light flashed a brilliant green. The heavy elevator doors slid open, welcoming her into the secure vertical shaft. She stepped inside and pressed the button for the top floor. She was ascending into the absolute heart of my corporate domain. When the doors opened again, Brittany stepped cautiously into the darkened executive penthouse suite. The air was cool and smelled of rich mahogany and expensive leather. The only illumination came from the moonlight spilling through the massive wraparound glass walls that overlooked the dark vineyards. She pulled a small flashlight from her pocket and clicked it on, the narrow beam of light sweeping across the plush carpet and settling on the massive walnut desk in the center of the room. She moved quickly toward the desk, her heart pounding in her chest. She was absolutely determined to rifle through the invisible owner's files. She was desperate to find any hidden financial leverage, any secret corporate strategy, or any sensitive documents she could use to blackmail the owner of Vanguard Holdings into forgiving Cameron's toxic debt. She approached the heavy wooden drawers, the trap tightening perfectly around her with every single step she took into the dark. The narrow beam of her flashlight swept across the polished surface of the massive walnut desk, catching the edges of several thick leather binders. Brittany's breathing was shallow and rapid in the silent, expansive room. She was looking for anything related to Cameron's holding company, a shred of evidence they could use to negotiate their way out of the suffocating grip of Vanguard Holdings. Her flashlight beam stopped abruptly on a bright red dossier positioned squarely in the center of the desk. The bold black lettering across the top of the thick folder read, "Asset Seizure Foreclosure Pending." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she flipped open the heavy cover. The first page was an executive summary detailing the catastrophic financial ruin of her husband's business. It outlined the immediate seizure of their commercial properties, the freezing of accounts, and the total liquidation of personal assets to satisfy the defaulted loans. Brittany let out a sharp, ragged gasp. Vanguard was preparing to dismantle Cameron's entire life. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but as she shifted her flashlight, the beam caught the reflection of a polished silver picture frame sitting near the corner of the workspace. She moved the light closer. The photograph behind the glass made her freeze entirely. It was a candid, high-resolution picture of Jasmine looking relaxed and radiant in a tailored business suit against the backdrop of the New York City skyline. Brittany stared at the photograph, her mind struggling to process the impossible image. Why would a framed picture of her estranged waitress sister be sitting in the center of the billionaire owner's private penthouse desk? The gears in Brittany's mind turned rapidly, fueled by arrogance. She did not conclude that Jasmine was the owner. Instead, she put two and two together and arrived at a wildly distorted 5. She concluded that Jasmine was sleeping with the billionaire owner of Aura Estates. In Brittany's twisted logic, it all made perfect sense. Jasmine had seduced a wealthy man to gain access to his resources. She was using her position to manipulate him into buying Cameron's debt, orchestrating this scheme simply to exact revenge on her family. A wave of vindictive triumph washed over Brittany. She quickly pulled her smartphone from her pocket and snapped clear photos of the foreclosure documents. She aimed her camera at the silver frame, capturing proof of Jasmine's presence. She opened her phone and navigated to the family group chat, typing with malicious speed. Jasmine is sleeping with the old boss to ruin us. I have proof. We are taking her down tomorrow morning. She hit send, closed the red folder, and sneaked out of the dark penthouse, utterly convinced she held the power to destroy me. Before leaving the penthouse, Brittany opened a new group chat titled Family Emergency Aura Weekend. She added Beatrice, Thomas, Cameron, and the concierge number printed on the event confirmation, believing it was my ordinary employee line. Then she uploaded the photographs and typed, Jasmine is sleeping with the old boss to ruin us. I have proof. We are taking her down tomorrow morning. My secure phone mirrored the message because the concierge number routed directly through my executive account. I read it without responding. For 9 years, they had possessed no private number for me and no access to my life. Brittany had just created the only channel through which they could reach me, and without realizing it, preserved their accusation and planned confrontation in writing. The next morning dawned with the breathtaking crisp beauty the Napa Valley was famous for. It was the day of the grand vow renewal. The resort's main garden was a hive of quiet, meticulous activity. Florists and event staff were busy transforming the sprawling lawn into a scene of unparalleled luxury. Thousands of white orchids were being woven into towering floral arches, and rows of pristine chairs faced a raised dais overlooking the valley. I stood near the central fountain, dressed in my simple navy blue uniform blazer, holding a clipboard and watching the final preparations. The air smelled of damp earth. I felt a profound tranquility. The trap was set. The digital evidence of their federal wire fraud was securely locked away, and the massive financial hammer of Vanguard Holdings was poised to drop. The sound of aggressive, heavy footsteps crunching against the white gravel path broke the serene morning silence. I slowly lowered my clipboard and turned to face the main pathway. Beatrice, Thomas, Brittany, and Cameron were marching toward me in a tight, aggressive formation. They looked terrible. Despite their expensive resort wear, their faces were drawn and pale, showing the effects of a panic-stricken night. Cameron looked physically ill, while Brittany walked with a feral, manic energy, clutching her phone tightly. Thomas and Beatrice flanked her, radiating the entitled fury of people who believed they had been wronged. They stopped a few feet away, cornering me against the stone fountain. Beatrice did not hesitate or demand an explanation. She stepped forward, her eyes wide and blazing with uncontrolled rage. She raised her right hand high in the air and brought it down with astonishing force. The slap struck me hard across the left cheek. The sharp, explosive crack of her palm hitting my skin echoed loudly across the garden, causing nearby florists to freeze. My head snapped to the side, and a hot, stinging pain instantly bloomed across my cheekbone. I stood perfectly still, turning my head back to face her, with an expression devoid of emotion. Beatrice was breathing heavily as she glared at me. "You disgusting girl," she spat, her voice vibrating with venom. "Blackmailing your own family by sleeping with a billionaire? After everything we did for you!" I met her furious gaze with a cold, unblinking stare. I let the silence stretch, allowing the absurdity of her accusation to hang in the air. Thomas suddenly pushed his way past his wife, his face flushed a deep mottled red with aggressive authority. He stepped into my personal space, towering over me. He raised his arm and violently pointed a thick, manicured finger directly at my face, stopping just an inch from my nose. "You listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful little tramp." Thomas snarled his voice, a harsh, demanding bark that carried across the lawn. "We know exactly what you are doing. We have the photos from his desk. We know you are trading favors with some rich old man to get access to his business files. You think you can use your dirty influence with your sugar daddy to squeeze Cameron and extort this family? You think you have the upper hand because you spread your legs for the owner of this resort." He took another step forward, his expensive leather shoes grinding into the gravel. "Well, your little blackmail scheme ends right here and right now. You are going to march back up to that penthouse and you are going to use whatever leverage you have over him to fix this. You are going to make him call off the hounds at Vanguard Holdings immediately. I want Cameron's corporate debt completely forgiven and wiped clean from their ledgers by noon today." He jabbed his finger closer to my eyes to emphasize his point. "And furthermore, you are going to ensure that this entire weekend is comped. Every single dime of the $325,000 bill for this wedding is going to be routed through your sugar daddy's personal expense account. We are not paying a single cent for any of this. If you do not do exactly as I say right this second, we are taking those photos straight to the press. We will leak the entire sordid story to every tabloid and gossip site in the country. We will expose you as a cheap, desperate gold digger who manipulates elderly executives. We will completely ruin your life and ensure you are thrown out on the street with absolutely nothing." I looked at the finger pointing in my face, then up at Thomas's desperate, arrogant eyes. I felt a slow, dark smile threaten to break across my stinging face. They had handed me their heads on a silver platter, and they had absolutely no idea. The sharp heat radiating across my left cheekbone was an anchor to the present moment. I did not raise my hand to soothe the skin. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not offer Beatrice the satisfaction of seeing a tear form in my eyes. Instead, I let the morning sunlight wash over me, illuminating the manicured garden and towering floral arches purchased with money Cameron did not actually possess. The desperation rolling off my family was palpable. They stood huddled together on the gravel path, intoxicated by their own perceived power. Thomas had his finger pointed aggressively near my face, his chest puffed out with the artificial authority of a patriarch who believed he had checkmated a disobedient child. He thought the out-of-context photographs Brittany had stolen from the penthouse desk were the ultimate leverage. In reality, they had just handed me the final piece of rope to complete their own hanging. I kept my breathing slow and measured, inhaling the scent of damp earth and crushed white orchids. The florists who had frozen at the sound of the slap were pretending to busy themselves with ribbons and shears. I looked at Thomas, analyzing the sweat beading near his hairline and the frantic twitch of his jaw. He was demanding a total erasure of Cameron's corporate debt and demanding that the staggering bill for this vow renewal be wiped away. It was a spectacular display of extortion, delivered loudly and clearly in front of witnesses. I reached into the deep pocket of my navy blue uniform blazer. Cameron flinched slightly, expecting me to pull out a phone to call the wealthy executive they believed I was sleeping with. Brittany leaned forward, a feral smile twisting her lips, ready to gloat. Instead, I smoothly extracted a sleek black digital tablet. The device was securely connected to Vanguard Holdings' primary financial network, the very network Brittany had clumsily accessed the night before. I held the tablet in front of me, tapping the screen to awaken the high-security financial software. The administrative screen showed the complete event ledger. The original package had been $250,000. Brittany's fraudulent upgrades had raised the total value to $325,000. Because the $50,000 deposit had already cleared, the outstanding balance was $275,000. "So let me get this on the record," I said. "You are demanding the return of the deposit, disputing the full $325,000 contract, and refusing to pay the remaining $275,000? Thomas laughed, as though the precision of my question proved I was frightened. "That is exactly what I said. Zero the whole thing out." I did not touch the confirmation field. Instead, I turned the tablet so Cameron could see the screen. His name and corporate title appeared beside the signature he had submitted when he approved the high-risk rider. "Thomas is not the contracting officer," I said. "Cameron is. I need the company's answer from him." For the first time, Cameron hesitated. His gaze moved from the balance to the clause displayed beneath it. A warning line stated that a formal refusal by the authorized officer could constitute a material default under related Vanguard agreements. His lips parted, but Brittany grabbed his arm. "Do not let a waitress intimidate you," she hissed. "Tell her we are not paying." Thomas stepped closer. "Say it, Cameron. She has no power unless you give it to her." Cameron looked at the florist, the staff, and his family. Pride defeated the final instinct warning him to stop. He straightened his shoulders and stared directly at me. "My company refuses the remaining balance," he said. "We dispute the entire $325,000. We demand the $50,000 deposit back, and we will not pay Aura Estates another cent." The tablet captured his voice and displayed a transcript. I asked one final question. "You are making that refusal as Cameron Hale, Chief Executive Officer and authorized signatory of the holding company named on this contract?" "Yes," he snapped. "Market refused." Two staff witnesses stood within hearing distance, and the garden security cameras were recording both audio and video under the event's posted safety policy. I angled the tablet toward the nearest camera, ensuring that Cameron's face, the contract number, and the outstanding balance appeared in the same frame. This was no ambiguous family argument. It was a documented commercial decision made in public by the officer responsible for the debt. I pressed the confirmation button. A green check appeared beside the words "Client Refusal, Verified Authorized Officer." The recording transcript, contract, and payment history were transmitted together to Vanguard's compliance server. "Invoice marked as refused by client," I said. Thomas smiled. Brittany lifted her phone like a trophy. Beatrice folded her arms with visible satisfaction. Cameron exhaled, believing he had finally shown strength. What none of them understood was that the total obligation exceeded the threshold written into Cameron's existing credit agreements. His verified refusal was not merely an argument with a resort. It was a material default owed to a Vanguard affiliate made by the officer legally empowered to bind the debtor. The cross-default clause could now accelerate his commercial notes, and Thomas's personal guarantees could be enforced with them. For one suspended second, Cameron looked relieved. He had expected an argument, a demand for immediate payment, or a call to security. Instead, he saw only a completed form. Thomas laughed and slapped him on the shoulder as if Cameron had finally proven himself worthy. Brittany lowered her phone with a triumphant smile, and Beatrice looked at my reddened cheek as though the slap had restored the natural order of the world. I did not explain that the tablet had created an evidentiary package rather than an automatic foreclosure. The refusal still required review and authorization under Vanguard's lending procedures. That distinction mattered. I would not seize anything through a theatrical button press or an improvised rule. I would return to the penthouse, compare the verified refusal against the signed loan documents, send the record to counsel, and authorize only the remedies the agreements actually permitted. Your position has been recorded exactly as stated, I said. I locked the tablet and slipped it into my blazer. Then I turned away from the fountain and walked past the floral arches without touching my stinging cheek. Behind me, Thomas was already telling the others that I had surrendered. Their laughter followed me across the gravel. By the time I reached the lobby, the recording and contract audit trail had been preserved on Vanguard's secure server, waiting for my final legal review. Nothing had been frozen yet. Nothing had been seized. But for the first time, every condition required to begin that process existed in one complete, undeniable file. By the time I crossed the grand lobby, Vanguard's compliance system had assembled the contract, Cameron's verified refusal, the audio record, and the guarantor documents into one review file. It had not frozen an account or issued a foreclosure notice. Those actions required my authorization and confirmation from counsel that every contractual condition had been satisfied. Thomas's 5 o'clock deadline was approaching, but it would not produce the rescue he expected. It marked the time I had reserved to complete the review with Vanguard's attorneys and banking liaison. If they confirmed, the file lawful enforcement would begin. I entered the private elevator, knowing the next decision would be mine, not an automated trick hidden inside a hotel tablet. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse, preparing to step into the light. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing me in a quiet cocoon of polished steel and mirrored glass. As the carriage ascended smoothly toward the top floor, I let out a long, slow breath. The stinging sensation on my left cheek had faded to a dull throb, serving as a physical reminder of the bridge my family had just burned. The doors glided open with a soft chime, and I stepped into the sanctuary of the executive penthouse suite. The morning sun poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, golden shadows across the rich mahogany furniture and the plush cream-colored rugs. It was a space designed for absolute control, a physical manifestation of the power I had spent years building from nothing. I walked directly to the massive walnut desk, the very same desk Brittany had violated the night before in her arrogant quest for leverage. I sat down in the high-backed leather chair, the material creaking softly under my weight, and awakened my secure corporate terminal. The dual screens flared to life instantly, casting a crisp, cool blue glow across my face. It was time to execute the final sequence of my strategy. I reached into the deep pocket of my blazer, retrieved my digital tablet, and established a direct, encrypted link to the Vanguard Holdings master mainframe. The interface required a secondary biometric scan to proceed. I pressed my thumb firmly against the glass reader, waiting for the system to verify my identity. "Access granted" flashed across the screen in bold green letters. I opened the audio file I had discreetly recorded during the confrontation in the garden just minutes ago. Thomas's arrogant, demanding voice filled the quiet penthouse, his absolute refusal to pay for the event echoing clearly from the high-fidelity desktop speakers. His mocking laughter and his explicit threat to destroy me sounded even more pathetic in the quiet authority of this room. I meticulously attached the unedited audio file to the master invoice for the vow renewal weekend, providing undeniable, legally binding proof of their verbal default. Next, I opened the encrypted evidence vault and separated the records by actor. Cameron's folder contained the emails with his chief financial officer, the false projections prepared for Mr. Gallagher, and messages proving the vow renewal was intended to create a misleading appearance of solvency. Brittany's folder contained the lobby terminal video override code, IP address timestamps, and keystroke log showing that she had added $75,000 in unauthorized services under my employee profile. I sent both packages to Vanguard's legal and compliance teams. Cameron's investor deception would be reviewed separately from Brittany's unauthorized system access and wire fraud. My instructions were precise: preserve the files, verify the chain of custody, and refer only conduct supported by evidence. There would be no confusion about who had done what. Minutes later, Vanguard's lead attorney joined the secure line with the banking liaison. They confirmed that Cameron's refusal satisfied the material default covenant, the event obligation exceeded the threshold, and Thomas's guarantees remained enforceable. Counsel authorized the remedies permitted by the loan documents: acceleration of the notes, restrictions on pledged accounts, and receivership over identified collateral. Only then did I open the dashboard governing Cameron's distressed debt portfolio. The red dossier Brittany had photographed expanded across my monitor, supported by the complete evidentiary file. I reviewed the contract number, recorded refusal guarantor schedule, and counsel's written approval one final time. Then I selected Authorize Enforcement. The system generated formal notices for the banks, Cameron's registered office, and Thomas's attorneys. This was not revenge disguised as paperwork. It was the lawful consequence of agreements they had signed and obligations they had deliberately refused. The screen immediately flooded with cascading green confirmation codes. The foreclosure was officially active. I picked up the secure landline resting on the corner of my desk and dialed the private direct number for Vanguard's primary banking liaison. A crisp, professional voice answered on the first ring, recognizing my secure extension immediately. I instructed him to initiate an emergency hard freeze on every single bank account associated with Cameron's holding company. I listened as he typed rapidly, confirming the account numbers I recited from the screen. But I was not finished. I then ordered him to trigger the cross-collateralization clauses hidden deep within the dense legal jargon of the original loan agreements. Thomas, in his boundless arrogance and desire to control Cameron's success, had foolishly co-signed Cameron's initial expansion loans years ago. That single signature tied his own personal wealth, his investment portfolios, and his company's entire liquidity directly to Cameron's failing enterprise. The bank liaison confirmed the directive. He assured me that the asset freeze would cascade through their entire financial network within the hour. Their platinum credit cards would be declined, their offshore and domestic bank accounts would be locked down, and their lucrative commercial properties would be placed under immediate receivership. The financial empire they had weaponized against me was now entirely under my control, and I was shutting it down, brick by brick, account by account. My next call was to my head of security. I instructed him to double the guard detail around the perimeter of the grand ballroom for the evening gala. I provided specific, unyielding orders that once the vow renewal ceremony concluded and the guests transitioned into the reception, no one from the immediate family was allowed to leave the premises under any circumstances. They were to be contained within the ballroom walls until I had delivered my final address. I wanted them surrounded by the very peers they were trying to impress when the truth came out. The trap was now fully operational, its steel jaws locked tight around them, waiting only for the final spring to be released. The hours passed with a quiet, satisfying inevitability. I spent the late afternoon monitoring the financial shockwaves registering on my secure terminal. I watched the digital logs confirm that the automated legal notices had been generated and successfully dispatched to Cameron's corporate headquarters and Thomas's private offices. I finally stepped away from the desk and took a long, scalding hot shower, washing away the scent of the garden and the lingering residue of my family's toxic hostility. When I emerged, wrapped in a plush white towel, the sun was beginning its dramatic descent. It painted the Napa Valley sky in brilliant, sweeping shades of bruised purple, deep magenta, and burning orange. Down below, the sprawling luxury resort was transitioning into its evening splendor. The grand ballroom, a spectacular architectural marvel of glass and steel suspended over the sloping vineyards, was already glowing with the light of thousands of floating candles. A renowned string quartet was playing softly as 200 of the most elite high society guests and wealthy investors began to arrive. They stepped out of sleek black luxury vehicles, dressed in their absolute finest formal wear, expecting a night of opulent celebration, fine dining, and lucrative corporate networking. They were completely unaware that they had actually been invited to witness a brutal financial execution. The stage was flawlessly set for the biggest, most public humiliation of Britney's entitled life. I stood in the center of the penthouse dressing room and looked at the garment hanging from the velvet mannequin. It was a custom-tailored $20,000 designer gown. The fabric was midnight blue silk. I shed my uniform, letting it fall. I stepped into the luxurious gown, fastened the clasps, slipped into designer heels, and clasped a flawless diamond necklace. I was finally ready. The grand ballroom was a masterpiece of elegance overlooking the moonlit vineyards. 200 influential socialites, investors, and industry leaders were seated at tables draped in ivory silk. Candles cast a warm glow, illuminating the diamonds and tuxedos of the oblivious guests. The air was filled with the clinking of crystal and the low murmur of wealth. I stood in the deep shadows near the arched oak double doors at the back of the room, completely transformed. The custom midnight blue silk gown draped flawlessly over my figure, the diamond necklace catching the light with every breath. I watched the stage at the front of the room, where Brittany and Cameron stood under a brilliant white spotlight. They were holding delicate champagne flutes, radiating an artificial, sickeningly sweet glow. Cameron was leaning casually into the microphone stand, playing the role of the humble, wildly successful titan of industry. He spun a rehearsed tale about his latest quarter of record-breaking profits, painting a picture of financial invincibility that was entirely fabricated. He praised Brittany for being the perfect corporate wife, the unwavering pillar of their beautiful, flawless family. Brittany beamed, pressing her head against his shoulder in a display that looked more like a staged photo op than genuine affection. She took the microphone from him, her emerald green dress shimmering as she spoke about their undeniable success, their unwavering commitment to excellence, and their deep, abiding love that had supposedly inspired this lavish vow renewal. In the front row, Mr. Gallagher lounged comfortably in his velvet chair. He held a glass of bourbon on the rocks, his expression an unreadable mask of polite amusement. He took a slow sip, his eyes flicking briefly toward the back of the room. He knew I was there, and he knew exactly what was about to happen. He was watching a dead man boast about his future. The crowd offered a polite, enthusiastic round of applause as Brittany finished her saccharine speech. She handed the sleek silver microphone to my mother, who had been waiting eagerly in the wings. Beatrice stepped into the center of the spotlight, smoothing the skirt of her expensive silk dress. She looked out over the sea of affluent guests, her chest puffed out with an overwhelming sense of superiority and triumph. This was the moment she had craved her entire life, the ultimate validation of her social climbing and ruthless ambition. She thanked the guests for attending, dropping the names of several prominent politicians to ensure everyone knew exactly how important she believed her family was. She spoke eloquently about the Wilson family legacy, a legacy she claimed was built on unwavering morals, strict discipline, and exceptional breeding. Her voice dripped with arrogant satisfaction as she surveyed the empire she thought she commanded. As she spoke, her gaze drifted toward the back of the vast ballroom. Her eyes scanned past the rows of white tables and stopped abruptly when she saw me standing near the grand entrance. The dim lighting obscured the exquisite details of my designer gown, but she recognized my silhouette immediately. In her mind, I was still the disobedient, blackmailing waitress who had dared to threaten their perfect evening. I saw her posture stiffen, a dark, vindictive gleam flashing in her eyes. She could not resist the opportunity to exert her dominance publicly, to punish me in front of the very people she was trying to impress. Beatrice leaned close to the microphone, her voice dropping into a tone of vicious mockery that amplified clearly through the sound system. "And a special thanks to the help tonight," Beatrice sneered into the mic, her words cutting through the warm atmosphere like shattered glass. "Especially my estranged daughter Jasmine, who finally found a way to be useful, even if her methods behind closed doors are utterly shameful." The ballroom plunged into a sudden, absolute silence. The polite applause died instantly. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the 200 high society guests. Heads turned rapidly as the wealthy attendees tried to process the shocking, incredibly inappropriate insult that had just been broadcast. Whispers erupted, the scandalized murmurs filling the heavy air. Beatrice stood on the stage with a smug, victorious smile permanently plastered on her face, utterly convinced she had just put me in my place. Thomas stood beside his wife, his chest puffed out with patriarchal pride, nodding in firm agreement with her public condemnation. Brittany let out a sharp, cruel laugh, covering her mouth with her hand in a poor display of feigned shock. Cameron smirked, taking another drink of his expensive champagne. The investors sitting near the front exchanged uncomfortable glances. They believed they had executed the ultimate victory, waiting for me to flee the room in tears of absolute humiliation. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate breath, squaring my shoulders. I stepped out of the shadows and into the soft light of the ballroom. I did not run. I did not hide my face. I looked directly at the stage and began to walk straight down the center aisle. I took each step with a steady, rhythmic pacing, allowing the sheer magnitude of the moment to sink in. The rustle of my silk dress was the only sound breaking the silence. As I moved into the light, the murmurs around me suddenly shifted in tone. The guests who had turned to stare at the disgraced waitress were confronted with a woman moving with the undeniable authority of an absolute sovereign. They saw the midnight blue silk gown that flowed around me like liquid water. They saw the flawless diamonds resting against my collarbone. They saw the cold, unwavering confidence burning in my eyes. The sea of wealthy, influential guests instinctively parted for me. Chairs were hurriedly scooted forward to give me a wide, unobstructed path. As I closed the distance to the stage, the expressions on my family's faces began to transform. Beatrice's smug, victorious smile faltered, her brow furrowing in deep confusion as she finally registered my appearance. Brittany's cruel laugh died in her throat, her eyes widening in unadulterated panic. She gripped Cameron's arm, her nails digging into his expensive tuxedo jacket. Cameron lowered his champagne flute, his face turning an ashen gray as a primal sense of dread washed over him. I reached the front of the ballroom, stopping just a few feet from the elevated stage. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the 4 terrified people standing under the bright spotlight. The head of my elite security detail, a massive man in a tailored dark suit, stepped silently out from the shadows. He moved with practiced military precision, approaching me with the utmost respect. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a sleek secondary wireless microphone, and placed it firmly into my waiting hand. He offered me a crisp bow before stepping back into the shadows, a clear display of absolute submission to his employer. The entire ballroom watched this exchange with bated breath. The tension in the air was so thick it felt tangible. Beatrice was now trembling visibly, her knuckles turning white as she clutched the microphone stand. Brittany's arrogant facade had completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but raw, frantic terror. I raised the microphone to my lips. I let a slow, calm smile spread across my face. When I finally spoke, my voice was smooth and completely devoid of mercy. It echoed through the silent ballroom, wrapping around my family like a heavy steel chain. "Thank you, Beatrice," I said, my voice carrying a crisp, undeniable authority that sliced through the heavy silence of the ballroom. I did not yell. I did not rush my words. I let the sound wash over the 200 influential guests, ensuring every single syllable was heard with absolute clarity. That was certainly an impassioned speech about family loyalty and moral superiority. But there is a slight correction that needs to be made for the record before we continue this lavish celebration. I paused, letting my gaze drift slowly from my mother's terrified face to Thomas's flushed, sweating brow, and finally to Brittany's trembling hands. The sheer panic radiating from them was intoxicating, but I maintained my mask of professional indifference. I am not the help tonight. I am not a waitress struggling to make ends meet at your expense. And I am most certainly not sleeping with the owner of this resort to gain leverage over your pathetic lives. The murmurs that had begun to rise from the tables instantly died away, replaced by a suffocating, breathless anticipation. Beatrice opened her mouth to speak, her jaw working up and down, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish pulled abruptly from the water. I took one final, deliberate breath, savoring the absolute control I held over the room. I raised my free hand, holding it high enough for everyone to see the flawless diamond bracelet catching the spotlight. Then, with a sharp, echoing crack, I snapped my fingers. Instantly, the massive projection screens positioned behind the elevated stage roared to life. The sudden burst of bright white light illuminated the dark mahogany panels and cast long, dramatic shadows across the faces of my family. The string quartet who had been waiting in the wings flinched at the abrupt visual explosion. On the twin screens, standing 2 stories tall, crisp digital documents appeared in high definition. They were not gossip columns or tabloid photos. They were certified, legally binding incorporation documents stamped with the official seals of the state and federal government. The first document displayed the master deed and ownership structure for Aura Estates, the very luxury resort where they were currently standing. The second document outlined the total controlling shares for Vanguard Holdings, the aggressive debt acquisition firm that held the keys to Cameron's entire financial existence. I watched as the wealthy investors and corporate titans in the front rows instinctively leaned forward their eyes, scanning the dense legal text. It did not take long for them to find the crucial information highlighted in bold red ink at the bottom of both pages. The sole owner, majority shareholder, and chief executive officer listed on every single document was not an invisible elderly billionaire. It was me, Jasmine Wilson. The realization hit the ballroom like a physical shockwave. A collective, resounding gasp erupted from the crowd, a sound composed of 200 people simultaneously processing an impossible truth. Glasses clinked as hands trembled. Wealthy socialites whispered frantically behind their hands, pointing at the screens and then back at me. I kept my eyes locked on the stage. The transformation in my family was absolute and devastating. Beatrice took a staggering step backward, her emerald silk dress catching on the microphone stand. She stared at the projection screens, her mouth hanging wide open in a grotesque mask of denial. Her eyes darted wildly between the name Jasmine Wilson in bold letters and the custom-tailored $20,000 designer gown I was currently wearing. Her brain simply could not reconcile the daughter she had abused and discarded with the apex predator standing before her. Thomas appeared to have stopped breathing altogether. The patriarchal arrogance that had defined his entire existence evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man. He clutched his chest, his face turning an unhealthy shade of gray as the reality of his situation set in. He had co-signed Cameron's loans. He had tied his own personal wealth to a company that was now completely owned by the girl he had threatened to destroy just this morning. In the front row, Mr. Gallagher finally lowered his glass of bourbon. A slow, knowing smile spread across his weathered face. He nodded his head once in a silent gesture of profound respect, acknowledging the masterful execution of a long game he had only begun to suspect. I took another step forward, the rustle of my silk gown drawing the attention back to me. The murmurs died down again. They were waiting for the final blow, and I was more than ready to deliver it. "You assumed I was weak because I chose to be quiet," I said, my voice projecting smoothly through the sound system. "You assumed I was desperate because I did not flaunt my success. You built an entire narrative based on your own arrogance and your need to feel superior." I turned my attention specifically to Brittany and Cameron. They were clinging to each other, their faces pale and slick with cold sweat. Brittany looked like she was going to be physically ill right there on the stage. But true power does not need to boast. True power simply waits for the perfect moment to reveal itself. I pressed a hidden button on the side of my microphone. The massive screens behind them switched rapidly, the incorporation documents vanishing in a blink. In their place, a new set of digital records appeared. On the left screen, a highly detailed server log materialized. It displayed the forged $75,000 champagne upgrade invoice that Brittany had tried to use to get me fired. But this was not just the invoice. It included the internal IP address, the exact digital timestamp, and a captured security still of Brittany using the unattended lobby terminal to alter the event folio. The undeniable proof of her petty malicious federal wire fraud was now broadcast 20 feet high for every single one of her high society peers to examine. The whispers in the ballroom turned sharp and condemning. People were shaking their heads, disgusted by the blatant criminality displayed before them. Brittany let out a choked, whimpering sob, covering her face with her hands as she desperately tried to hide from the burning spotlight of her own public ruin. Before the stunned crowd could fully process the forgery, the right screen flickered and shifted. The bright red dossier from the penthouse desk appeared, dominating the entire visual space above the stage. It was the immediate foreclosure notice for Cameron's firm, bearing the seal of Vanguard Holdings. Below the bold lettering, bright red alert boxes flashed in real time. They detailed the emergency asset freeze I had initiated at the 5 p.m. deadline. Corporate accounts, personal checking, offshore holdings, and the cross-collateralized trust funds tied to Thomas were marked with a single, devastating word: seized. Cameron's trembling knees finally gave out entirely. He collapsed heavily onto the stage, his champagne flute shattering against the hardwood floor. He stared up at the glowing screens, realizing he was not just bankrupt. He was completely erased. The glorious empire they had boasted about moments ago was now nothing but dust. I looked at the four of them, broken and exposed under the unforgiving light. The absolute truth was finally out in the open. There were no more lies to hide behind. The trap had closed completely around them. They had tried to bury me, but they had only succeeded in digging their own graves. I stood perfectly still on the polished hardwood floor, letting the heavy silence of the grand ballroom stretch out for another agonizing moment. The sheer magnitude of the devastation displayed on the towering projection screens behind them cast an eerie, cold blue light over the entire stage. The 200 affluent guests in the audience remained absolutely frozen, their eyes darting rapidly between the damning digital evidence of complete financial ruin and the four shattered figures trembling under the spotlight. I looked directly at my pale, trembling family. Cameron was still on his knees, his expensive tuxedo pants soaking up the spilled champagne from his shattered flute. His chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths as he stared blankly at the bright red foreclosure alert. Brittany was hyperventilating, her hands desperately gripping her perfectly styled hair. Beatrice looked as though she had aged 2 decades in the span of 60 seconds. Thomas, the patriarch, who had demanded my absolute obedience just hours ago, was shaking violently, his face a mottled, unhealthy shade of purple. I brought the microphone back to my lips, My voice echoed with crystal clarity, cutting through their shock with surgical precision. "Since you explicitly refused to pay your bill this morning," I said, pausing deliberately to ensure every single guest heard the words. "And since Brittany committed federal wire fraud to fabricate a luxury upgrade on Vanguard Holdings' secure servers, I am officially executing the foreclosure on Cameron's firm." The words struck them like physical blows. Cameron flinched, a ragged sob tearing from his throat. Brittany shook her head wildly, whispering desperate, incoherent denials that no one could hear. I lowered the microphone slightly, offering them a smile. "Enjoy the champagne," I added, my tone smooth and completely unapologetic. "You truly cannot afford it." For a fraction of a second, the ballroom remained suspended in that perfect, unbroken silence. Then absolute pandemonium erupted. The collective shock of the high society audience finally shattered, replaced by a deafening roar of overlapping voices, gasps, and frantic whispers. The wealthy socialites and influential corporate leaders were not just witnessing a simple family disagreement. They were witnessing the brutal, unmitigated slaughter of a financial empire. In the front row, Mr. Gallagher stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and commanded immediate attention. He did not look at me. He kept his steely, unforgiving gaze locked entirely on Cameron. The older billionaire adjusted the cuffs of his tailored jacket, his face a mask of absolute, unadulterated disgust. He shook his head once, a slow, condemning motion that conveyed more contempt than 1,000 screamed insults ever could. He turned his back on the stage. That single action was the catalyst for the rest of the room. The other prominent investors, the men and women Cameron had spent months trying to court and impress, immediately followed suit. The sound of heavy wooden chairs scraping against the floor filled the air as dozens of people stood up in unison. They gathered their coats and their evening bags, murmuring in harsh, judgmental tones about the blatant criminality and the spectacular embarrassment they had just witnessed. Mr. Gallagher led the exodus, walking with calm, measured steps down the center aisle, taking the vast majority of the influential guests with him. They were leaving the sinking ship, and they were ensuring that everyone knew they wanted absolutely nothing to do with the wreckage of Cameron's life. On the stage, the reality of the mass departure finally snapped Cameron out of his paralyzed state. He scrambled to his feet, slipping slightly on the spilled champagne, and spun around to face his wife. The look of utter devastation on his face rapidly contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury.
"What did you do?"
Cameron screamed, his voice cracking with the force of his anger. He lunged toward Brittany, his hands raised as if he wanted to shake the truth out of her. "Federal wire fraud. Are you completely out of your mind? You ruined me. You absolutely ruined everything." Brittany stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the edge of the stage. She held her hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture, tears streaking her immaculate makeup and leaving dark, ugly trails of mascara down her cheeks. "I was just trying to help!" she shrieked hysterically, her voice echoing shrilly through the cavernous room. "I was trying to get her fired! I was doing it for us! You told me we needed to save money."
"I told you to cut costs!"
Cameron roared back, spittle flying from his lips as he closed the distance between them.
"I did not tell you to commit a federal crime and hand my entire company over to her."
Their bitter, vicious argument played out under the harsh glare of the projection screens, completely ignored by the retreating audience, but amplified by the acoustics of the ballroom. Beatrice, unable to cope with the rapid disintegration of her perfect family facade, decided to deploy her oldest and most reliable defense mechanism. She let out a loud, theatrical gasp, throwing a hand dramatically to her forehead. With a loud wail, she swayed heavily to the side and collapsed backward, fainting directly into one of the plush velvet chairs positioned behind her on the stage. She sprawled across the cushions, her eyes fluttering shut as she waited for the inevitable rush of concerned guests to run to her aid. She waited for someone to bring her water to fan her face, to offer her the center of attention and the sympathy she believed she inherently deserved. But no one rushed to help her. Not a single person moved toward the stage. The remaining guests were too busy watching the implosion of her son-in-law, and the security detail remained firmly at their posts. Beatrice lay there in her expensive emerald gown, an ignored, irrelevant prop in the background of her own orchestrated disaster. The sheer, pathetic nature of her fake swoon only highlighted the complete loss of their social standing. Thomas, however, was not seeking sympathy. He was seeking vengeance. The absolute destruction of his financial security triggered by his foolish decision to co-sign Cameron's loans had finally registered in his mind. The cross-collateralization meant he was just as ruined as Cameron, and the realization broke whatever fragile grip he still held on his sanity. His face twisted into an ugly, snarling mask of sheer hatred. He let out a wordless, guttural roar. He completely abandoned any pretense of upper-class civility and charged forward, his heavy boots pounding against the wooden stage. He was aiming directly for me, his fists clenched tight at his sides, intent on doing physical harm to the daughter who had dared to dismantle his kingdom. I did not even flinch. I stood my ground, my hands resting loosely at my sides, my posture perfectly and completely relaxed. Before Thomas could even reach the edge of the elevated platform, the deep shadows at the perimeter of the ballroom suddenly surged to life. My heavily armed elite security team seamlessly stepped into the bright light. They moved with terrifying, perfectly synchronized precision. They surrounded the shattered family, grabbing Thomas by the arms and hauling him back. Without any hesitation, the guards forcibly escorted them off the stage, marching them toward the back service doors. The trap held. I turned away from the service doors and walked away from the wreckage. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind me, instantly silencing the frantic whispers and chaotic aftermath. I made my way to the private executive elevator, the adrenaline pulsing hot through my veins. When the doors opened to the penthouse, I stepped into the quiet sanctuary. The lights were dimmed, casting a soft, golden glow over the mahogany furniture. I walked directly to the wet bar. Sitting on the marble counter, perfectly chilled in a silver bucket, was the exact bottle of vintage champagne Brittany had fraudulently tried to charge to the master account. I peeled back the gold foil, untwisted the wire cage, and popped the cork. The soft sigh of escaping pressure was the only sound in the massive suite. I poured the pale, bubbling liquid into a tall crystal flute, savoring the delicate aroma of toasted brioche and crisp apple. I kicked off my designer heels, relishing the feeling of the plush rug beneath my bare feet, and walked out onto the expansive wraparound balcony. The weather had turned, as if the sky recognized the absolute shift in power. A sudden rain was sweeping across the Napa Valley vineyards, hammering against the glass railing. The cold wind whipped at the silk of my gown, but I did not retreat inside. I walked to the edge and looked down at the main resort driveway, a sweeping, circular path illuminated by security floodlights. My security team had escorted them exactly where I wanted them. Down below, exposed to the downpour, were Beatrice, Thomas, Brittany, and Cameron. The valets had already retrieved their vehicles, but there was no bellhop service for them tonight. The security guards stood in a silent, intimidating perimeter, arms crossed, forcing my family to carry their own luggage. I took a slow sip of the vintage champagne, letting the crisp, cold liquid slide down my throat as I watched the scene unfold. Thomas was shouting, his face red and contorted, but the wind carried his words away. He was gesturing wildly at the guards, demanding respect, but the men in suits remained completely unmoving. They were my men now. Beatrice was struggling with a leather suitcase, the wheels catching on the wet cobblestones. Her silk dress was plastered to her body, ruined by the relentless rain. She slipped, dropping her handbag into a growing puddle. For a fraction of a second, she looked up toward the penthouse. Even from this distance, I could feel the devastation radiating from her. She finally understood that the daughter she had treated like dirt had just buried her alive. Brittany was sobbing openly, shivering in the cold, while Cameron tried to stuff their bags into the trunk of his car. A car that would likely be repossessed by Monday morning. They looked small, pathetic, and entirely defeated. I retrieved my smartphone and opened Family Emergency Aura Weekend, the group Brittany had created with the resort concierge number the night before. The screen showed that every member had seen the foreclosure alerts and the final photographs from the ballroom, yet no one wrote a word. For 10 minutes, the chat remained completely still. The silence felt heavier than the rain. Down in the cars, they were discovering the consequences, one account at a time. Cameron's corporate card failed at the valet desk. Thomas received an automated notice that transactions involving his pledged investment account required receiver approval. Brittany tried to book another hotel and watched the payment decline. The legal process was not erasing their property by magic. It was restricting assets identified in the signed guarantees, while counsel and the banks completed the formal enforcement steps. Then Cameron called the concierge line. Because that number routed through my executive phone, his name appeared on my screen. I let it ring until voicemail answered. Beatrice called next, followed by Thomas and Brittany. 10 missed calls became 20. 20 became 40. They alternated between the concierge line and the group's call function, apparently believing persistence could restore the authority they had lost. Within a single hour, the counter reached 69. Between calls, messages flooded the chat. Beatrice suddenly remembered that mothers and daughters were supposed to forgive each other. Thomas ordered me to stop this nonsense before he contacted his attorneys. Cameron offered to negotiate a payment plan after spending the entire weekend pretending money was irrelevant. Brittany begged me to release enough available funds for fuel and a hotel room. Not one message mentioned the porch. No one apologized for the slap, the extortion threat, the stolen keycard, or the crime Brittany had tried to place under my identity. They were not grieving the loss of a daughter or sister. They were grieving the loss of access to money, status, protection, and a target who had once absorbed every insult in silence. Even their apologies were demands wearing softer clothes. I read every single word they sent. I read their panic, I read their desperation, and I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, enduring peace. I did not answer a single call. I did not reply to their frantic apologies or their pathetic demands. I took another sip of my champagne, the vintage tasting sweeter with every passing second. I tapped the screen, opening the keyboard in the family group chat. I typed one final definitive message. There is no room for you at my table. I hit send. Then, with a few swift taps, I deleted the entire group chat. I went into my settings and blocked Beatrice, Thomas, Brittany, and Cameron permanently. I erased their numbers, their voices, and their toxic presence from my existence. I set my phone face down on the glass patio table. The heavy rain had slowed down, revealing a brilliant silver moon. I looked out over the thriving empire I built with my own 2 hands. The ultimate, deliciously sweet revenge was finally complete. I read the messages once, not because I doubted my decision, but because I wanted to see whether any of them understood what they had done. They did not. They regretted losing access to money, status, and protection. They did not regret leaving a 24-year-old woman outside with a paper plate or trying to destroy her when she survived without them. I typed one sentence into the group. There is no room for you at my table. After it was delivered, I deleted the chat, blocked the concierge route from their numbers, and placed the phone face down. The rain thinned over the vineyards, and the lights of Ara Estates reflected across the wet stone below. 9 years earlier, I had sat in a rusted car promising that I would never again beg for warmth from people who enjoyed keeping me cold. I had believed success would heal that wound. It had not. What healed it was finally accepting that their cruelty had never defined my value. I raised the champagne glass toward the quiet valley. My victory was not that they had become poor. It was that they no longer possessed any authority over my life. The table I had built was mine, and from that night forward, every seat at it would belong only to people capable of respect. Have you ever been underestimated or mistreated by those closest to you, only to build your own success in silence and prove them entirely wrong? Share your story of reclaiming your power in the comments below. If this lesson resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more empowering stories of triumph, justice, and self-discovery.